Hello, welcome to the Subjective Space with me, Sindhu Rajasekaran. Today we have an amazing guest, Lauren Humphries-Brooks. Hi, Lauren.
Hi.
Lauren is a freelance editor, writer, and film critic with a master's degree in cinema studies from New York University and in creative writing from the University of Edinburgh. She's the co-host of the feminist film podcast Citizen Dame and has written extensively on the Avengers TV show and Alfred Hitchcock. All right. Welcome, Lauren. I was just going to say my dad was a big fan of Hitchcock. So, like, as a child, I was made to watch, like, Dial M for Murder and The Birds, like, way before I was, legally allowed to watch it.
Let's just talk about Hitchcock then. Like, I can do that for an hour, 100%.
So you can tell me, what's your favorite Hitchcock film?
My favorite is The Lady Vanishes. Have you seen that one?
No.
It's one of his. It's kind of right at the end of his British career, right before he goes to Hollywood. It's funny. It's like kind of starts out as a screwball comedy and then turns into like an espionage mystery film. That's my favorite. I think his greatest film is Psycho. So it's that kind of combination of things. Yeah. But yeah, like I always go back to The Lady Vanishes. I love it.
So I just wanted to ask you first, how did you get interested in films? Like, was it something that growing up, like, was it books first or films?
It was probably both. I mean, growing up, I watched a lot of, like, my parents would just rent old films, particularly. So, I watched all of the Disney films and things like that, but also Marx Brothers, Buster Keaton, Charlie Chaplin, things like that. And then I probably did watch a lot of Hitchcock films at way too early an age, like you. And actually, Hitchcock was very much my way into like being interested in film as an art form beyond, just being entertained by it. And I think that he was the first director that I looked at and thought, this is like, actually, there's something more to this than simply, oh, it's funny or it's scary or anything like that. And at the same time, I read all the time. My parents are very literary people, very like encouraging of read whatever you want to all the time. So I read a lot of things like Sherlock Holmes stories and stuff like that. So it was kind of equal in terms of what I was doing.
So since you run a feminist film podcast, did you always look at, films through a feminist lens? Like, was that a natural thing for you since the very beginning? Or was that like an aha moment in your life where like, oh my God, like, because what happened with me is that I'd read so much stuff and then suddenly in my life, I woke up to this thing of like, I disagree with these men, like, in a lot of stuff. Like, I'm like, what the fuck? How did I like this stuff before? Like, so did you always have a feminist perspective or did it come to you later?
I think that, so when I think that when I really began studying film, first of all at the University of St. Andrews, and then particularly at NYU, which I went to Tisch for film studies, and that was when I began to, it was one of those times where I was in my 20s. I was just like, I need to choose a theory that I just agree with 100%, which is not actually how film theory works, as anyone knows, and I learned that very quickly. But it was, yeah, I began to very much like understand what feminist film theory actually was and what it looked like. I read a lot of the big ones, Laura Mulvey, Barbara Creed, Carol Clover, people like that. And that was at the point where you begin to go like, okay, yes, this is what I agree with. And I think that particularly, honestly, in the past 5, even 10 years, that was when feminist film theory came up again for me. And doing the podcast, and at the same time as Me Too started and Time's Up and all of those things, and of really beginning to dig into the way that cinematic culture shapes how we talk about actual human beings and the people who get to make movies, the people who don't get to make movies, the perspective that is being taken from films. So I've always been a feminist. I became more of a feminist probably in the past 10 years than I ever was before. Uh, but but in terms of like the actual interest in feminist film theory and feminist film criticism, definitely the podcast in tandem with actually we started our podcast, and then literally the week after we recorded our first episode, Harvey Weinstein was outed. So that was like, we started that, we're like, oh, it's a feminist film podcast. Like, oh, it's a feminist film podcast now.
You have a lot to talk about. I'm sure you had a lot to
Yeah.
talk about back then.
Yeah,
Right.
we spent weeks basically just going through like the Weinstein stuff, all and then all of the kind of the cascading things that were going on as well.
So let's talk about perspective since you brought that up, right? So that's like the one of the first things you mentioned, Malvi, the male gaze, so to speak,
Hmm.
and how cinema has, for the most part, in the beginning, been from that gaze. Like, that's the problem, according to me. I'm not a big fan of mainstream films. Growing up, my dad was an indie
Hmm.
filmmaker, so I watched a lot of indie stuff. I mentioned that to you before. But we have to start with Barbie. Like, we cannot not talk about Barbie, right?
Yeah.
So first off, what are your thoughts about Barbie? Do you think Barbie is a feminist film? Was it snubbed at the Oscars? Should we still watch the Oscars? That's a different question. You can answer that too. Should we still bother? But was it snubbed? And do you think it's a feminist film? What do you think?
I think those are two different questions a little bit. Yes, it is a feminist film. I know a lot of people have complained about Barbie as kind of its feminism 101, which it is in a lot of ways. It's very straightforward. It's very clear about its perspective, I think. It's hard to misunderstand it. I know some people try, but it's very difficult to do that. Um, but the it being feminism 101 essentially says that we don't get a lot of that in cinema. Like, the subtleties of it don't always come through. And a lot of the times when we talk about feminist cinema, we're not talking about mainstream films. We're talking about we're talking about Chantal Ackerman. We're talking about like other films that are that are underground. We're talking about lesbian films, but things that are not being treated in the mainstream. Mainstream feminist filmmaking isn't that prevalent. And to have something like Barbie, which is, it's a Mattel film, right? It's a Warner Brothers film. It's about a toy. But to actually take that and be like, okay, we're going to use this to teach girls and to teach women about feminism in a way that is very funny and in a way that's very entertaining. And also, I think, brings home everybody talks about the America Ferrera speech in Barbie, and I think that it's a fantastic speech, but it also has to be taken within context with everything else that the film is doing at the same time. And it does come at this point where it's like this eruption of, it's unfair to be treated like this. It's unfair to have to live these contradictions day in and day out. And it's something that every single woman I know experiences in one way or another. So that's why it resonated so much. Um, and at the same time, it's important for men to hear that as well, because particularly again in the past like 5 or 10 years, I've listened to so many particularly straight men go like, oh, I never thought of it like that. It's like, yeah, this is our lives, this is how we
Yeah.
live, right?
Yeah.
uh the other thing that I really appreciate about Barbie is the fact that, in the midst of all this, it's funny. It's not one of the issues that we have sometimes with feminist filmmaking and with films that are stated as being feminist is that it's a downer. A lot of it comes down to, oh, it's horrible being a woman. And it begins to feel like, it's almost these very often male filmmakers saying like, oh, there's an undercurrent of, isn't it great that I don't have to deal with this? Isn't it great that I don't have to be female? And the thing is, most women that I know like being women. We don't have a problem being
Yeah.
women in this world. It's hard, but it's also joyful and funny, and there are all kinds of wonderful
Yeah.
things about
It's
it.
not like every day we're victims and it's so horrible. And it's like, it's not just
Yeah,
that.
exactly. And like so many films that talk about feminism or that are told from a feminist perspective are like, oh, women are constantly frightened. They're constantly afraid of men. They're, living their lives in fear. They're, being assaulted. All of these different things. Like, yeah, that's a part of our lives. That's something that's real. But that's not the only part. Like, I don't sit around in my apartment going like, what if I get raped now? Like, that's insane.
Yeah.
Um, Sorry,
Mm.
did I lose you?
No, no, no. I'm here. I'm here. No, I was just. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can
Can
hear you.
you?
Sorry.
Yeah, okay, okay, that's fine. No, I was just gonna say that that's something that comes up in my own work all the time. Like because I'm brown, because I'm a woman, because I'm queer, people just assume that I'm always gonna write from a position of like victimhood. Like I write from a position of agency, or I like to look at things from a position of, or sort of look at characters like that too. Like if I'm reviewing something or reading something, I'm just not looking for all the pain. I'm also looking for the joy. I'm also looking for all of that. It's a mix. And often people just don't understand that. They think that it has to be about like all the evils and all the horrible things
Yeah.
that go with it. So Barbie that way is an uplifting sort of film, if you could say. Would you say that? Or is that even
Yeah.
a problem?
Yeah, no, no, exactly. And I think that again, we can't take one of the issues with again female made cinema and feminist cinema in general is that we want everything to represent all of the experiences all the time, and no film is capable of doing that. So one of the wonderful things about Barbie is that it is kind of opening another door into like, okay, here is a different way to talk about being female. Here is something funny, something entertaining. We can have musical numbers and ridiculous clothing, like all kinds of things. And at the same time have this wonderful feminist perspective. So we can have all of those things. All of those things are important. I do think that it's very important that female directors, female writers, actresses, etc., are the ones who tell those stories because I've seen some fantastic feminist films by men, but we need to give more and more space to women to tell those stories from all different sides.
I was just going to say Almodovar, right? It's like,
Yeah.
what do you think about it? I mean, it's nice, but it's still from and going on to Poor Things, which I mentioned to you before,
Mhm.
which was a big hit at the Oscars. Coming back to the Oscars, like a lot of people loved Poor Things. I don't know if you read the book. I read the book, but I
I haven't,
haven't
no.
watched the movie. So when I read the book, I loved the way it was written because Alistair Gray is great, and but at the same time, I constantly would be thinking, oh my god, this is like a man's wet dream, right? Because it's like a woman who's like essentially like a doll. Like it's funny. So two questions for you. What do you think about the Oscars? Going back to that, if you can answer that question, and also about movies like this, which are made by men, where the protagonist is a woman, and it probably looks at a woman's life in a very sort of through a big prism and sort of in many different ways, but it's still made by a man, and why is that
Mhm.
problematic if it is?
Well, first, in terms of the Oscars, earlier you asked about was Barbie snubbed? Yes, I think that it was snubbed in the sense that you have a lead actress and a female director. There have been, in the history of the Oscars, there have only been 7 women nominated for Best Director. 3 of them have won, 3 of them fairly recently, too. So that's a problem. So I think it was definitely snubbed, especially in nominating Ryan Gosling and not nominating Margot Robbie or Greta Gerwig. And is that saying like, oh, this is the biggest issue? No, absolutely not. And I think that the conversation about that has kind of weighed down the successes of someone like Lily Gladstone, who was also nominated. But at the same time, it's really difficult to look at a movie like Barbie and be like, we're going to nominate the guy. Like that's that's a
But
problem.
there's something going on there. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a problem.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
that's
well, I think that that is an issue. Should we watch the Oscars? The Oscars are the Oscars are the Oscars. They're a popularity contest. They are significant. It does matter who wins Oscars because it's about some of it is about funding and recognition. Um, so but I think that we treat the Oscars as kind of this pinnacle of filmmaking, and it isn't. It's a pinnacle of a particular kind of filmmaking, and we know how political a lot of it is. We know how people have been kind of shunted to the side. Like I say, 7 women have only ever been nominated for Best Director, and a lot more women have directed films than 7. So, and that includes Jane Campion, who's nominated twice and won
mm,
once. So sorry,
mm.
what was the other question
that, that
about? Should we
that
ask?
brings me. No, I think it sort of leads into the next question I had for you anyway about where are all the women at? Like, where is all, I mean, because we spoke about erasure, right? Like I remember
Mhm.
reading somewhere that Some of the first women, I mean, some of the first color films were colored actually by female artists. Like, we don't even hear
Yeah.
about that anymore. Like, nobody speaks about that. Like, it's not that women have not been in the film industry, because the same thing, even in Bollywood, some of the earliest artists, who made movies were courtesans, right? Women who came from courtesans families, and who'd made all these. They've been erased completely. So it's like it just, I think all the industries, they just erase the women who've done so much in the. It's not that they've not been there. So as you're saying, historically that's true, but also in contemporary times, it's like it's amazing that so many women are making films, but nobody's recognizing them. Like, it cannot be that their films are not good enough, or it cannot be it's not as
Hmm.
artistic enough. I mean, I'm sure it's not, I'm sure it's great. So where is it,
Where is it?
and where are they?
Uh, well, I mean, just to go back to your point about women kind of being erased from history, being erased from cinematic history, fairly recently, and again, recently in terms of film history, has been when we've begun to recognize people like Alice Guy Blaché and Lois Weber, and a little bit later Dorothy Arzner. And so these are women who were there. They were there from the beginning of cinema. Um, Lois Weber was one of the highest paid directors at Universal in 1914, right? And that's at the same time that Cecil B. DeMille is there, right? So women have always been present, and female directors have always been present, and that's not even touching on the writers and the costumers and the co-directors and the assistant directors and all of the women who've been involved in cinema. But very quickly they were kind of shunted to the side, and like, no, we're going to forget about them, we're not going to pay attention to them, they're not significant, right? And they were significant, they absolutely are significant. Dorothy Arzner basically invented the boom mic, for God's sake. um
Oh, did
so
she? Oh my God.
yeah, she did. This is something I just recently learned. Yeah,
Yeah.
she figured out how to essentially suspend a microphone on a
Yeah.
fishing pole in order to follow her lead actress around.
I mean, that's
And
like such a basic cinema thing. Like, we don't
yeah,
know that a woman invented that. Like,
yeah, and this was like, it was completely it was necessary, but this was something that she like innovated, and nobody talks about it. She was an out lesbian director in Hollywood in the 1920s and 30s. And then basically as soon as the production code came in, she began petering off, and suddenly she wasn't, there anymore. She wasn't making films anymore. She was the only female studio director for during that period, and really like all the way through the studio system. Sorry, I went off on a tangent there. So where
oh
are the
no, no, no,
women?
that's okay. That's a tangent. I want. Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, we can come back to the history of it, but like, even
Mhm.
to it's so horrible that we're talking about these women from 1914 who've been erased, and then it's still the same fucking case. Like, it's still the case. It's 2024 now. Like, and
Yeah.
we're still acting like there are no women making films. I mean, it cannot be true, and it is not true.
Yeah, no, it isn't. And at the same time, I think that the last statistics that I saw from a couple years ago was something like 12% of the mainstream films were directed by women.
Hmm.
And of those, of that 12%, you're talking about the majority of them being white women, right? So you've got an even smaller percentage if you're talking about not white women.
Yeah.
Uh, and that's, yeah, that's one of the problems, is that women have to fight for opportunities in ways that white men in particular do not. um, and and so I think a lot of the female directors are kind of working within indies. They're working outside of the mainstream. That's still definitely a thing. You're also talking about, so you're talking about people who are being marginalized, undoubtedly. And the problem is then, of course, those stories get marginalized. And we're making progress, definitely. I think that the number of female directors has risen compared to, 20 or 30 years ago, but it's still a struggle. And there's no reason for it, other than sexism. There is no reason for it. It's
Yeah. I
not like
mean,
women don't want to make movies.
hmm. And do you think it's also to do with perspective? Do you think women bring in this other or new or different perspective that is sort of, it clashes with what the mainstream is? Like, the mainstream is this particular, like, a way of looking at things, and they want to fit everything else into it. And women sometimes don't want to fit.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think that the perspective is always the default is always white men, white cisgender men, and that's been the attitude. And so when we begin to be like, hey, wait a minute, maybe that shouldn't be the default, because why is it the default? Because white men are not the pinnacle of anything, right? They're a member of humanity, but they're not the sole members of humanity.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so I think as a
And
result,
it's
we
not
just
a particularly like very artistic or amazing perspective either. It's not the white male
yeah.
perspective.
Yeah, and like and I think the problem is then we get into like, oh, are you saying the white male perspective isn't important? It's like, well, it's important because
Yeah.
that's
Among
fine.
other. Yeah.
Yeah, but we need equality, right? That's
Yeah.
or at least more equality, like a little bit more. Just give us a
Mhm.
little bit, right? And yeah, I think that then becomes this bigger problem because we continue to just assume that the default perspective, the default is the male gaze, and the default is the white male perspective, and you always fall back onto that, and then it becomes like, oh well, this is niche, right? Women's films are niche, queer films are niche, um, films made by people of color, films like the centralizing anyone who isn't the straight white cisgender man is niche, and no one will pay for that. And I do think that that's, again, go back to Barbie, that's why it's really important, um to note the fact that this film wasn't niche, it was hugely popular, and that's very important, again, as long as we're continuing to kind of push that issue and be like, this isn't the only film, this shouldn't be the last film like this for the next 20 years. It needs to keep on going.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the history, as in like, you were talking about how there were so many women directors or writers and all of those people in Hollywood in the 1914 or 40s, where you're saying.
Mhm.
And you do review a lot of these old films in on Citizen Dame as well. So I wanted to ask you, what is an absolute, like, what would you say is a great feminist film or a proto-feminist film, you can call it, to watch from that period?
Ooh, trying to think about that a little bit. So, one of the issues with a lot of these films is that they're not easily available. So I was talking about Dorothy Arzner. It is very difficult to get a hold of a lot of her films, particularly in good copies. Um, Two of the films that I think are very good to watch from her is, again, the only female studio director of the time period, is Dance Girl Dance, which is in the United States. It's available on Criterion. Honor Among Lovers is another one that, again, and it's, I think it's a question of, are these necessarily feminist? I think they are. They definitely are exploring relationships in a way that we don't completely expect. There's definitely a different perspective being taken, because you have a woman behind the camera, and it isn't as reliant on what we usually type as the male gaze. I think that there's still a little bit of that, uh, but I think both of those films are very good kind of gateways into watching films by female directors, and because they're very recognizable, they look like, they're Hollywood studio films from the 1930s. They've got very recognizable stars in them. The other one that I think is really interesting by Arzner is Merrily We Go to Hell, which is a film. I'm trying to remember the year. I think it's like 1931, 1932. Um, that one is actually about a relationship in which they get married, they're like together, and then the husband decides, I want to start having affairs with other people. I want to have an open relationship. And the wife is not happy about this, but is like, okay, fine. And then he gets mad at her for going off and having other relationships. And so there's this conflict that develops between the two of them, that is very intense. And it's also involved with like alcoholism and stuff like that. But it's this, like, he's being hypocritical. He's like, no, 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 it's okay for me, but not okay for you. And
I
what's really
mean,
interesting about this,
yeah,
yeah, yeah, exactly. So what's really interesting about this is 1931, 1932.
yeah,
These are like, this is a mainstream film, and this is actually being depicted and discussed,
yeah.
very much from a more feminist perspective.
Right. Yeah. That would not, that would still be like, a complicated thing to watch today. Like a lot of families
Yeah.
would not watch it with their kids. So, you know, yeah. So I wanted to also ask you next about noir, because I know you're a big fan and I
Yeah.
love noir myself. And about the prototypes of women in those films, right? There is
Mhm.
obviously the femme fatales, and I'm a post-feminist, so I love femme fatales. Do not have a problem with, them being sassy or murdering anybody, whatever it is. I'm happy they're doing it. But there's also the other one of the sort of girl next door, I think. What other prototypes
Mhm.
are there in noir?
I mean, those are the two big ones.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. There's also, it's an unfortunate, I'm trying to think of a better term, kind of the Spider Woman, the Dragon Lady, the very kind of the Orientalism that gets going in those films. Again, but very often those are another version of the femme fatale. I'm trying to think if there are any other like major female like stereotypes from that same period. I think the femme fatale gets so much focus because she is this example within, again, you have to remember that this is during the production code, so there are only certain ways that women are allowed to be represented, and definitely sexual women, sexualized women, no, that's not okay. We're not doing that, right? um but most femme fatales, and the reason why she becomes such a feminist prototype is because they're much more active. They're allowed to do things. They're allowed to have sex and commit murder and
Yeah.
do all the fun stuff, and be bad, right? And they are always punished for it at the end. But during the film itself, you very often go like, oh, she's got a point, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's worth
So she,
murdering that person.
yeah, and the films often tread the line on that one as well. You
Mm-hmm.
think about someone like Barbara Stanwyck in Double Indemnity, where as soon as she comes on the screen, you're like, dude, she's gonna kill you. Like you're dead. This is over. Like,
Yeah.
and so it is that kind of highlighting of feminine power in a very constricted way, but is present and is something that can then, when the strictures of the production code begin to relax, the femme fatale does change and does get to be more proactive and maybe sometimes get to win in the end as well.
I think that's the thing, right? This is also something that I've found in my historical research with myths, even from India, because there are these myths of women doing these amazing things, like they're like being these sort of autocrats or whatever. But the punishment always comes for them in the end, because the
Yeah.
patriarchy has to punish these women for being sexual or being like agentive in whatever way. So they have to be punished. So this is the thing about noir. Like I'm thinking, is there feminist noir? Because all of these women, in the end, they're punished, or they're like sweet and they're like fall in love and they're like whatever. So I don't know, can it be feminist? I guess that's my question.
Noir from like the 1940s, no, pretty much not.
Mhm.
I do think that you can read some noirs as feminist to a certain degree, but again, you're always going to run right into the production code. Um, she's always going to be punished in the end. She's always going to be destroyed in some way. Get a little bit. There's a question in like The Big Sleep of whether or not Lauren Bacall is going to be the femme fatale or not, and she turns out not to be. But again, they're very, very careful with her. They very much are like, okay, we've got to like make it work out so that it can end happily, basically. Um, but then again, when you get the relaxation of some of that, in neo noir, you do begin to get the bad girl winning, basically. So you get films like Body Heat, which is significantly later, but is playing with film noir archetypes. Um, and I don't want to go into too many spoilers about it, but it is basically about an incredibly intelligent woman screwing over a bunch of stupid men. And it's very
I'll watch
satisfying for
it.
that.
Yeah, I'll watch it for sure.
Yes. All right. So yeah, within the period, you're never going to get like the bad girl winning, as it were. The femme fatale is never going to succeed. She's either going to be subdued in some way, so she's going to be made over by love or something like that. That'll happen every once in a while, or she's going to die.
Yeah.
There's really no choice and
That's the only
unfortunately,
ending. That's the only
yeah,
ending that you can imagine for these women, right? They have to die, or a man sort of wins her over or tames her.
Yeah, and a lot of it, there's some films, like even something like Double Indemnity, I kind of feel like they're pushing towards it. They're trying really hard. They're like, it would be great if we could end this differently, but we can't. Uh, and yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the next thing I think we spoke about this before. I was going to ask you about the uplifting thing, right? The about how movies about certain things have to be uplifting, or like
Hmm.
you had a review about All You Hear Is Noise, on your website,
Hmm.
and you write in it about how this the characters in this film speak for themselves, falling neither into condescension nor turning into an uplifting story about overcoming disability. So it's like with all these movies where it's from the point of view of not this like this sort of this superman gaze or whatever that is, like a male gaze of like, oh yeah, we're like we are like including these people, or we are like, it's not from their gaze but from the gaze of the person itself who has
Hmm.
whatever it is that they are, like whoever they are, from their perspective. So when it is from their perspective, does it necessarily have to be an uplifting film, or does it have to be anything at all? Like, that's the problem, right? With Hollywood, everything
Yeah.
has to be, it has to be like an uplifting thing in the end, like, or it has to be a, I don't know, it has all these tropes that it has to fit into. So what do you think is like when you have to let the characters speak? I think that itself is very feminist, like just
Yeah.
diversifying and letting people speak for themselves.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, now that particular film is about disability.
Mm.
And I do think that, so often when we're talking about disability, it is this like, I've got a friend who is disabled. She's a film critic. And she talks a lot about this issue of like, disabled people having to be like, you have to overcome things, you have to be inspirational. And it's always this inspirational thing to the not disabled people in the audience to be like, oh, you can elevate yourself, you can be better. um and of course that's problematic because and very often again it is storytellers, writers, directors, etc., who are not themselves disabled, not themselves women, etc., who are saying like, okay, we have to make this inspirational at some level. And I think again it goes back to some of the things we were talking about with Barbie. There has to be space for everything. There has to be space for all the kind of the spectrum of human experience. We talk about films, one of the other tropes that we get into when we talk about queer films is that issue of burying your gaze, the issue of kind of downers, basically, like it's horrible to be queer. And then you talk about films that actually deal with queer joy, that are, showing happy endings, normal happy endings for queer people.
Yeah.
And so I think that it's one of those that there's always this danger that you're going to fall into, everything is great, and it's great being queer or disabled or female, etc., etc. And then you can also fall into everything is terrible.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's the worst being anything
Yeah.
else other than like, and yeah, you have to have a balance because ultimately it is a balance. Like
Mhm.
most of us, our lives are not perfect, but they're not the worst thing ever, and you have to be able to tell both sides of those stories. So
Mhm.
um and again, this is why you need to have diversity behind the camera as well as in front of the camera. It has to be the writers and the directors and the showrunners, etc., telling stories, not that they have necessarily 100% experience, but that they understand in a way that you can't. Like, I'm going back to the straight white cis male, there can be plenty of people who are very well meaning, but you don't have that experience. And so you need someone with that experience to be telling the story as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. Totally. So, the next thing I wanted to ask you was another problematic thing. I think I mentioned to you before. So, I was a huge
So
Woody
many
Allen
problems.
fan. So many
Mm.
problems. I was a big Woody Allen film growing up. So, like when I was a teenager, Woody Allen films were like my background for my life. Like, I would just like play it, and then like this my life goes on, right? And then so it was just that, and then when all the stuff happened, when all the when the scandals broke out and all the things came out, it became so problematic for me to go watch those movies again. I cannot enjoy watching Manhattan or Annie. Like I just cannot watch it anymore without feeling like, oh, I shouldn't be watching this. So it's so hard. So what do you think about the art and the artist thing? Like,
Oh god.
what do we do about this?
Uh, what do we do about it? I don't know.
Do we watch
I
it? Do we watch it? Do we like, or
I think that it depends on, I think it depends a lot on the individual. And I think it also depends on why you're watching it. So, as someone, for myself, as someone who's a film scholar who's done film scholarship, I'm very interested in what a film does. So, I may not necessarily be looking at, you know, is the director problematic? Is the actor problematic? Has they said bad things? Etc. I mean, I hate to say it, one of I think one of the greatest directors currently living is probably Roman Polanski, and that's that's a
not a
bad
good?
thing,
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
yeah.
Uh, at the same time, am I going to watch Rosemary's Baby through the lens of I don't like who Roman Polanski is as a human being, or am I going to watch it through the lens of what is this film actually doing? So some of it is about the way that we watch films and the way that we want to watch a film. Um, when it comes to someone like Woody Allen, I think it's even harder in some ways because you're talking about someone who isn't just behind the camera, he's also in front of the camera a lot.
So
So,
narcissistic. It's just
yeah,
like he is the movie. Like you cannot watch it without Woody Allen in it.
exactly. So it's very hard to pull him out to kind of be like, okay, we're just going to look at this as a film, right?
Mhm.
Especially when you're talking about something like Annie Hall or Manhattan Murder Mystery or any of the films where he's actually like the lead.
Yeah.
Uh, at the same time, from a historical perspective, these are very important films. They're very influential films, and they're films that have to be talked about and have to be experienced. The question is, can we enjoy them? And that's where it becomes, I think, up to the individual. What are you comfortable with? I do think that there's a tendency to publicly be like, oh, I don't like Woody Allen films, or I don't like, it's like, well, no, that's not true. You probably do. You probably do like Annie Hall. Like a lot of
Yeah.
people do. And then but then it turns into the self-justification of like, well, I like it because of something other than Woody Allen. And at some point we have to admit that all of these films, most of the films that definitely American ones, definitely Western ones, are being made in incredibly patriarchal cultures where very few directors, writers, actors, etc., are going to be 100% pure. And so it does have to come down to, are you able to distance yourself? Do you want to distance yourself? I certainly have a much easier time. Alfred Hitchcock is not the greatest guy in the world. I have an easier time watching Hitchcock films than I do something by Polanski or Woody Allen because I know that I'm not benefiting Hitchcock in any way. I'm not giving him money, right? So there are all of those different things that kind of wrap up into it. But I do think we have to step away from kind of accusing each other of like, oh, you watched Annie Hall, therefore you're a bad person. And
Yeah.
that's one of the issues that then gets wrapped up into it.
Hmm. Yeah, the judgment of others. Like I cannot go out and say that used to like it even like, yeah. So, since we're almost running out of time, the last thing I want to
Mm.
talk to you about is horror films. So, let me
Yeah.
disclaimer is that I'm really scared of horror films because they really interfere with. I have a very tenuous relationship with reality. So when I watch horror, it sort of messes with my head, right? So unless I'm writing the dark stories myself, which I do, that's okay. But I cannot indulge in other people's stuff. So having said that, I don't watch much horror. So what is? I know you're into horror films essentially and feminist horror films. So let's speak about feminist horror films. So is that a new thing that's taking off around the world?
There have been a lot more films. I think that horror always has a certain edge of feminism a little bit, because so often women within horror either get to be the victims or they get to be the monsters. So there's kind of this dichotomy that exists. That's not. I don't be prescriptive about it, but that's usually the position that they occupy. One of the interesting things when it comes to actually reading films from a feminist lens is those films where women do get to be the monsters, and get to make the choice to be the monsters. So I think one of the best contemporary feminist horror films is The Witch, which is directed by Robert Eggers, and I think it's deeply feminist, and it's very disturbing as a result because you're talking about this film in which this girl is essentially forced into becoming the monster. because she does run directly into this choice within this incredibly patriarchal, incredibly misogynist society of either you are going to be the victim, either you are going to be destroyed at the end, or and you're going to be self-sacrificing, which is really what the patriarchy wants of you. We want you to be a martyr, or you're going to find freedom in evil, essentially, in becoming the monster. And I think it's a fantastic commentary. And so when you begin to get into something like that, um, and a lot of my male friends will argue with me about just like, no, it's horrible. It's like, no, you don't understand. This is the choice.
Yeah.
This is the choice these women have. You either die, you're either the victim, or you get a certain degree of freedom. It's a horrible freedom, but it's a freedom by becoming the monster. And so I guarantee you 9 out of 10 women are going to choose to be the monster.
Yeah, yeah, I
um,
would agree with that.
it's this gaining of power within this incredibly patriarchal and misogynist, society. Uh, so that's one of the things I really like about horror is that you can get those sorts of stories, and even older horror films that you can read through those lenses and be like, well, this is actually interesting. Films like Cat People, which is I think from 1941, which is actually in a lot of ways is the woman as victim and as monster.
Yeah.
It's basically a female werewolf story in a certain sense, and that in itself is like there is this fascinating kind of liberation that you get to see in those kinds of films. Rosemary's Baby is another example,
Yeah.
actually, of this woman who's
Mhm.
being victimized and ultimately chooses at the end to become the most powerful person in the world, literally, by being the mother of the Antichrist, right? And
Yeah.
it's horrible, but there's this triumphant moment of like she's taking all of the power away from the people that have victimized her and is turning it against them.
Yeah.
uh, and so that's where I think horror gets really interesting when you're talking about female representation and
Mhm.
feminism.
I think I told you about this on email. There is this new movie, not new, relatively old now, but a movie called Bulbul, and it's actually a Hindi movie or a Bengali movie, I don't know. But it is the same thing. It's about this woman who is a victim who becomes the witch in the end, and then she's like sort of haunting everybody who's like, ever given her grief, and puts them in their place. So I think it's great. I think that sort of way of looking, because society tends to demonize women anyway when they do not
Hmm.
conform to patriarchal rules. So might as well be demons. I mean, let them
Yep.
go on a rampage, right? So I think that's great. So that is. So what other stuff do you review on Citizen Dame? Like, do you do all sorts of horror? Is it like any particular type of horror?
A lot of the time, one of the things that we do on the podcast regularly is during October, we'll do nothing but horror films. So we'll talk about all kinds of things.
Hmm.
Always, we're always filtering it through our own perspectives, and we are feminists, so we're usually talking about the roles of women, and also some of those issues of how you navigate being a feminist and watching films that are not at all feminist. I've got a poster behind me of Suspiria,
Yeah.
and I love giallo horror, and it is not feminist. So I'm watching these films just like, oh yeah, these people are getting murdered and disemboweled and all that. It's so much fun. Uh, and and that's one of those things that you kind of turn off part of your brain a little bit, but also are willing to critique it and willing to be like, this is not okay, but here's maybe why we enjoy it, and again finding that catharsis in horror films and in even getting that sort of bloodlust, I guess.
Yeah, it is a bloodlust. Yeah. Okay. Okay. My last question for you is a non-horror thing. It's
Okay.
about New York. It's about how do you like the city? And see, again, Woody Allen has romanticized New York for me, unfortunately, and it's just so hard for me to sort of. So even when I came to New York like last year, it was like I was looking at it like, oh yeah, I've seen this and I'm like, damn it, shouldn't be thinking about that movie. But yeah. So what is New York to you? Is
uh,
it romantic to you? What do you like about the city?
it's I often joke that it is the most beautiful, horrible city in the world. I love it. Like, I love New York City. It is exactly that. Like, you go into places in Manhattan, you're just like, oh my God, this is Manhattan. This is like,
Yes.
the buildings. This is, Times Square and Brooklyn Bridge. And, I was just down in the Village the other night. And I was like, oh, I love the Village at night and all of the lights and everything. Uh, so I adore New York. It's a horrible place in a lot of ways. Like,
Yeah.
it's smelly, it's dirty, it's nasty, but I can say that you can't. Like, you're not allowed to talk about New York as being a horrible place. Like, no, it's a great city in the world then.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, New York is such a unique place, and it is romantic. It is like, I look out my balcony window and like I see the Empire State Building and stuff like that. And it is this very like glorious place. It is very cinematic. There's a reason why there's so many films made in New York. First of all, because so many people have lived here. Um, and second of all, it does have those elements where, like I say, you're down in the Village and like walking around and you're suddenly in Washington Square Park and there are all of these bright lights and then it gets dark and it's very real and it's very human. And one of the things I love about it is that, I've lived here for nearly a decade now. Again, when I came back, I've been back and forth pretty much my entire life. And every single time, there's gentrification, there are new buildings going up. My neighborhood is getting gentrified more. Um, but every single time that happens, there's still this New Yorkiness that just kind of erupts from the sidewalk. It's never easy. It's never clean. It's never going to be clean.
Yeah.
And I really like that. Like, it's very, very human and
And
real,
crowded
and
and very
crowded. Yeah.
populated. Yeah. You
Crowded,
like that?
noisy,
Yeah.
active, like,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's great. I just moved to a suburb in Vancouver, so it's like so weird because I always live in the West End or like in the city, in downtown. So it's just so weird because you don't have people on the streets like as much, and I'm like, where are all the people? It's just so quiet. This is no, I can't survive here. Like it's. I like crowded places too. I like it. I like people around, just going out and just looking at everyone. So great.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. I think we had a great chat about a lot of stuff. So I'm gonna stop recording now.